We're now going to turn to that peculiar field known as social psychology. You may remember in the opening video I said that the way in which we characterize the individual determines what we see as the social order. If we place all responsibility inside an individual for everything they do, then we're not acknowledging any social influences whatsoever. So psychology, which is largely concerned with individuals, has always had a sort of a hard time with our social being. Social psychology represents this challenge very well, and we will see a sequence of three landmark studies in social psychology, each of which is frankly disastrously bad science. They have been very thought-provoking, and it's important when we review work in social psychology to understand that psychology is born out of the need to care for each other, out of a sense of mutual recognition, and its forays into science and the manner in which it's wielded in scientific debate can lead to problems if we forget this. So as we're reviewing social psychology, we will find that the investigations that were conducted were very strongly motivated out of human concern. The motivations, however, turn out to be very local in space and time, and the studies look weird then when you move on and stand back from them a little bit. So as we're discussing each of these three cases, one thing that's very important to remember is to recognize the anxiety that caused the studies to be conducted in the first place. So social psychology often has this character of responding to the fears of the moment. So there'll be tons of social psychology on the virus, for example, which will look weird 10 years later. And the first case we're going to look at is a guy called Harry Harlow, who was doing his work mainly in the 1950s and early 1960s in the United States. Now, Harry Harlow had a very big view of himself. He waxed poetic about love. He wrote on the science of love. And I hope this makes you slightly nervous. I'm not sure scientists are the right people to ask about love. You can make your own mind up there. I think he's a creepy scientist. He worked on love, but not with humans. He worked with rhesus macaque monkeys, those monkeys who have done so much for the scientific enterprise. And he had a laboratory in which these monkeys were routinely and formally tortured. In particular, he was very interested in the attachment of the infant monkey to the mother. And what he would do is he would separate the infants from their mother at birth. And famously, he would provide them with two different substitute mothers. One of them was a cold wire frame, nothing motherly-like about it, but it gave milk. The other one shown there was a cloth surrogate mother, which at least had the appearance of sort of fur, but it had no milk. And what he found was that these monkeys, who were enormously traumatized by being taken apart from their mother, clung to the fur-like covering of the softer monkey, but they would leave it and run panicked over to the wireframe monkey to get the milk and then come back and cling here again, traumatized. Now, what he claimed to have shown here is that infant monkeys need social touch and affection. This is one of those cases where you'd have to say, duh. I don't know that anyone was ever in doubt of that. The terms of art from Harry Harlow's lab are interesting. The pit of despair we'll see on the next slide. The rape rack was a device used for forced breeding among monkeys. Here's the pit of despair. It was a bucket, basically, used as a solitary isolation chamber to keep monkeys isolated. So his experiments targeted social bonding, maternal, mother-infant interactions. They looked at the effects of deprivation, of intrusions onto what one might consider to be a normal social development. And based on his studies about monkeys, he provided advice about how humans ought to interact with their infants. Now, I'm just going to suggest that mothers are actually in a better place to ask here than psychologists. And the male psychologist in the white coat is not necessarily the best source of authoritative information about how to raise infants. We'll get to the motivation for why these peculiar studies were done before. First, just for your entertainment, but it wasn't entertaining for the monkeys, here's an example of a little robot that was used to scare monkeys, to administer scare to a little rhesus macaque monkey. It looks wonderful. It scares the bejesus out of that monkey. One effect of Harry Harlow's experiments was the awareness that animals were being mistreated in scientific laboratories. And that led, in one sense, to PETA, the Society for the Protection of Animals, animal liberation movement, and the ethical standards around the animals that we use in our research, and in particular the use of primates, have changed greatly since his day. So I guess that's one good development. His work did give rise to useful theory within the human psychology and led to the development of something called attachment theory. This is mainly associated with the names of John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth. And attachment theory is a little outdated now, but in the 60s and 70s it was a very important field of theory in which the the significance for later development of early goings-on, early bonding between infant and mother was made clear. And this had knock-on effects and led, for example, to the reform of institutions, of orphanages and things like that. So there was some good downstream consequences of this work, but the work itself was particularly problematic, both in its aspirations to speak with the voice of science to mothers, doing what mothers have always done, and in its unfortunate use of animals. So why did it come about? Well, we can understand this much better if we remember where this happened. This was America after the Second World War. Now, by the 1950s, America in the previous 3 decades had undergone huge demographic changes. We'd had the Great Depression, we'd had the Dust Bowl, and we'd had the Second World War, all coming on the heels of the First World War. This had led to population movement. There were large areas of farmland that were devastated in the Dust Bowl, and the Depression led people to move into cities. And after the Second World War, the economy was reorganized, and the dream of the suburban home with 2.2 children and a station wagon outside was being strongly pushed on people. You're familiar with this from advertising literature from the time. The consumer society was born here, and the nuclear family, in which parents lived with children in a suburban house, was born here. That was not a typical social order before this. One of the effects of this was to disrupt the way knowledge is normally passed on within a family. So people previously had much more extended social connections. They weren't as mobile, they didn't move around as much, so there would be other family members around. You didn't necessarily live in a huge extended family, but there were other family members around. Whereas this new social model of the suburban nuclear family left a lot of parents feeling helpless. And when you feel helpless, when you don't know who to turn to, scientists look like an obvious target. So this is the reason that this work caught on, and it was responding to a genuine fear, which is the confusion introduced by the disruption into the normal way that information is passed around within families. So that's Harry Harlow. We'll have a look at another odd case from social psychology in the next one.